The morning mist clings to Henderson Field like a shroud. February 12th, 1943. Guadalcanal's mud-soaked runway stretches into the tropical dawn, scarred by months of desperate fighting. The sound cuts through the humid air first, a deep, throaty rumble that's different from anything heard before in the Pacific. 24 bent-winged silhouettes emerge from the gloom like prehistoric predators. Major William Geese stands transfixed as his F4U Corsairs taxi in perfect formation, their inverted gull wings catching the early light. These aren't the nimble wildcats that barely held the line. These are something entirely new. "Jesus Christ," whispers a ground crewman, watching the massive fighters roll past. Look at the size of those props. Gies knows what his Marines don't yet understand. For 18 months, Japanese Zero pilots have owned these skies. They've turned aerial combat into an art form, graceful, deadly, seemingly invincible. Every American pilot who's faced them speaks in hushed, reverent tones about their impossible maneuverability, their ability to appear from nowhere and vanish like ghosts. But today, that changes. 300 miles north, in the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul, Zero pilots are already climbing into their cockpits for the morning patrol. Veterans with dozens of kills, men who've made their reputation destroying everything America could throw at them. They have no idea they're about to encounter an aircraft that will shatter everything they believe about air combat. The Corsair engines growl to life, their 2,400 horsepower Pratt and Whitney double wasps drowning out the jungle sounds. Gizi feels the raw power vibrating through his boots, up into his chest. How do you break the confidence of pilots who've never truly been beaten? How do you defeat an enemy that's turned aerial superiority into psychological warfare? In the next 83 days, the Pacific War is about to be rewritten in fire and speed. To understand what happened next, you have to grasp what the Zero meant to the Pacific War. This wasn't just an airplane. It was a weapon of psychological destruction that had redefined the possible. Since Pearl Harbor, American pilots had learned to fear that distinctive elliptical wing shape. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrange anything in the American arsenal. With its 1,130 horsepower Sakai engine and featherweight construction, it danced through the sky like physics didn't apply. Japanese aces like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Saburo Sakai had turned aerial combat into deadly ballet, destroying American fighters with an almost casual elegance. The Zero was like fighting a ghost, remembered Marine Captain Marion Carl. You'd line up a shot and it would just disappear. Then suddenly it's on your tail, and you're the one running. At Henderson Field, the mathematics of survival were brutally simple. American F4F Wildcats maxed out at 318 mph, 60 m per slower than a Zero. In a climbing fight, the Japanese fighter gained altitude at 3,090 feet per minute, while Wildcats struggled to match even 2,000. When Zeros dove out of the sun, American pilots had two choices: run or die. But the Corsairs arriving at Guadalcanal carried specifications that would have seemed like fantasy just months before. Top speed, 446 miles per hour. Rate of climb, 4,360 feet per minute. 6 50 caliber machine guns. And most crucially, that massive four-bladed propeller powered by an engine that produced more than double the horsepower of anything the Japanese flew. The first hint of what was coming arrived on February 14th, just 2 days after VMF 124's arrival. 12 Corsairs escorted Army bombers toward Bougainville in what should have been a routine mission. Instead, they flew straight into a buzzsaw of Japanese fighters. The battle that followed defied every expectation. For the first time in the Pacific War, American fighters climbed with the Zeros instead of running. They matched their speed, absorbed their attacks, and struck back with devastating firepower. When the smoke cleared, both sides had suffered losses, but something fundamental had shifted. I saw one of those new Marines stay with a Zero through a complete loop, radioed an Army P-38 pilot. That's impossible. Zeros don't get outmaneuvered. The Japanese pilots returning to Rabaul carried disturbing reports. These new American fighters were different. They could climb. They could run down a Zero in level flight. Most unsettling of all, they made a sound unlike anything heard before, a rising, wailing whistle that seemed to come from hell itself. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, studied the combat reports with growing unease. The Americans had somehow leaped ahead technologically, but the implications ran deeper than mere performance specifications. For 18 months, Zero pilots had fought with absolute confidence in their aircraft's superiority. That psychological edge, the knowledge that you flew the best fighter in the world, was as valuable as any technical advantage. Now, for the first time, that confidence was cracking. VMF 124, pilot Second Lieutenant Ken Walsh had been flying since 1938, but nothing had prepared him for the Corsair's raw power. When you pushed that throttle forward, he later recalled, you could feel 2,400 horses trying to tear the airplane apart. The acceleration was like being shot out of a cannon. By March, Walsh and his squadron mates were developing new tactics built around their speed advantage. No more defensive fighting, no more running from Zeros. The Corsairs would climb above the enemy, dive with crushing speed, and tear through Japanese formations before anyone could react. The Japanese had spent 18 months teaching American pilots to fear them. Now, in the humid skies above the Solomon Islands, a new kind of terror was about to be unleashed, one that screamed down from the heavens with the sound of approaching death. April 1st, 1943. The morning air above the Russell Islands shimmers with heat and tension as radar operators track a massive Japanese formation approaching from the north. 40-plus contacts, bombers escorted by the cream of Japanese naval aviation, veterans who've dominated Pacific skies for 18 brutal months. Ken Walsh adjusts his oxygen mask and peers through the bulletproof glass of his Corsair's cockpit. At 26, the former enlisted man carries the weathered confidence of someone who's been flying Marine fighters since before the war. But today feels different. Today, the Americans aren't running. Tally-ho! Zeke's 11 o'clock high. The radio crackles with controlled excitement as VMF 124 spots the enemy formation 3,000 feet above. In the old days, those positions would mean certain death for American fighters. Zeros own the high-altitude game. Walsh pushes his throttle to the firewall. The massive double Wasp engine responds with a roar that vibrates through his entire body. Around him, 11 other Corsairs surge upward at over 4,000 feet per minute, their bent wings cutting through the tropical air with predatory grace. The Japanese pilots see them coming and react with textbook precision. The Zero formation splits into defensive elements, preparing for the turning fight where their superior maneuverability has destroyed so many American fighters. But something goes wrong. The Corsairs don't slow down. They don't try to turn. They keep climbing, matching the Zero's altitude gain and then surpassing it. "What the hell?" mutters Zero pilot petty officer Tetsuo Iwamoto, watching the bent-winged fighters rise to meet them on equal terms. In 18 months of combat, no American fighter has ever outclimbed a Zero. The laws of aerial physics seem to be rewriting themselves. Walsh reaches the Zero's altitude with airspeed to spare. For the first time in Pacific War history, an American pilot looks down at Japanese fighters from a position of tactical superiority. The psychological impact is instant and devastating. "This is it," he whispers into his throat microphone. "Time to show them what American engineering can do." The Corsairs roll into their attack like hunting hawks. Walsh selects his first target, a Zero pulling into a climbing turn, its pilot confident in his aircraft's legendary agility. But Walsh isn't turning. He's diving with the accumulated energy of superior altitude and devastating speed. The Corsair's airspeed indicator climbs past 400 mph, then 420, then 440. The wind screaming over the fighter's unique wing configuration creates a sound unlike anything heard in aerial combat, a rising banshee wail that announces death from above. Ground forces will later call it whistling death, but right now it's simply the sound of technological revolution. Walsh's 650 caliber machine guns erupts in perfect convergence. The Zero, caught in a climbing turn with no energy to maneuver, disintegrates under the impact of armor-piercing rounds. 1 second, it's a graceful fighter. The next, it's burning wreckage tumbling toward the ocean. But Walsh isn't finished. The Corsair's speed carries him through the Japanese formation like a thunderbolt. He pulls up into a climbing turn, something that should be impossible at this airspeed, and spots his second target. Another Zero, this one trying to escape in a dive. The Japanese pilot pushes his aircraft to maximum speed, confident that no American fighter can match a Zero's velocity in a dive. He's wrong, catastrophically wrong. Walsh's Corsair gains on the fleeing Zero like a shark chasing a goldfish. The Japanese aircraft tops out at 400 mph. The Corsair is still accelerating through 430. The gap closes with mathematical inevitability. The second Zero erupts in flames. Around them, the battle has become a slaughter. Corsairs tear through the Japanese formation with impunity, their speed and climb rate negating every tactical advantage the Zeros once possessed. Japanese pilots who've spent months perfecting the art of aerial combat suddenly find themselves outmatched by pure technological superiority. Lieutenant Iwamoto tries desperately to engage a Corsair in the turning fight where Zeros excel. But the American pilot refuses to cooperate. Instead of turning, he climbs vertically, something no American fighter has ever done in combat. The Corsair claws skyward at over 4,000 feet per minute, while Iwamoto's Zero struggles to match even 3,000. Impossible, he breathes, watching the bent-winged fighter disappear into the sun above him. This cannot be happening. Walsh spots his third target, a Zero diving toward friendly bombers below. This time, he doesn't hesitate. Rolling inverted, he pulls the Corsair into a screaming dive that builds speed like an avalanche. The fighter's unique whistle rises to a shriek that can be heard for miles. The Zero pilot sees him coming, but realizes with growing horror that escape is impossible. The American fighter is simply too fast, too powerful, too advanced. Walsh's guns speak for the third time in less than 5 minutes. The Zero comes apart like tissue paper, its lightweight construction no match for concentrated 50 caliber fire. When the battle ends, 12 Corsairs have destroyed 20 Japanese aircraft without a single loss. For the first time in the Pacific War, American fighters have achieved decisive air superiority over the legendary Zero. As the formations separate, Japanese pilots carry shocking news back to Rabaul. The Americans have a new fighter. It's faster than a Zero. It climbs better than a Zero. And it makes a sound that freezes the blood of anyone who hears it. Second Lieutenant Ken Walsh has just become the first Corsair ace. But more importantly, he's shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. The psychological warfare that began at Pearl Harbor is finally being turned around. The age of Zero dominance is over. The era of whistling death has begun. The numbers tell one story: 11-to-1 kill ratio. 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Only 189 Corsairs lost in air-to-air combat. But statistics cannot capture what really changed in the Pacific skies After April 1943, Ken Walsh would finish the war as a Medal of Honor recipient with 21 confirmed kills. But on that April morning above the Russell Islands, he accomplished something more significant than personal glory. He broke the psychological stranglehold that Japanese aviation had maintained over the Pacific theater. After that first encounter with the Corsairs, recalled captured Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai years later, we knew the war had changed. We were no longer fighting inferior aircraft flown by inexperienced pilots. We were facing machines that could outperform our best fighters, flown by men who had learned to use their technological advantage with deadly precision. The sound became part of the terror. Japanese ground forces throughout the Solomon Islands would later describe the psychological impact of hearing Corsairs approaching. That distinctive whistle rising to a shriek as the bent-winged fighters dove to attack. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese pilots warning each other about the aircraft that screams, and ground commanders reporting that their troops would break and run at the first sound of approaching Corsairs. By August 1943, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington's VMF 214 Black Sheep would push Corsair tactics to their logical extreme. Flying from forward bases, they would taunt Japanese pilots over the radio, challenging them to climb up and fight. When the Zeros rose to meet them, they found American fighters that could match them at every altitude and exceed them in speed, firepower, and pilot aggression. The technological revolution that began with VMF 124's arrival at Henderson Field rippled across the entire Pacific War. Aircraft carriers that had been forced to stay hundreds of miles from Japanese-controlled airspace could now approach with confidence, knowing their Corsair escorts could handle any opposition. Ground forces advancing across the Central Pacific found themselves protected by fighters that could deliver devastating close air support without fear of Japanese interception. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. For 18 months, Zero pilots had fought with absolute confidence in their equipment's superiority. That confidence, built on genuine technological advantage, had translated into tactical dominance and strategic initiative. The Corsair reversed that equation in 83 days of combat. American pilots went from running defensive battles to seeking out Japanese formations, confident that their aircraft's performance would overcome any numerical disadvantage. Today, as military planners study hypersonic weapons, stealth technology, and artificial intelligence, the lesson of the Corsair remains relevant. Technological leaps don't just change tactics, they reshape the entire psychology of warfare. Sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat comes down to which side can climb faster, hit harder, and inspire more fear in their enemies. In 1943, that side flew bent-winged fighters that screamed death from the Pacific skies. Want to know more about the legendary aircraft that changed the Pacific War? Subscribe and hit the notification bell to explore more untold stories of aviation history that shaped our world.